So, Psalm 57. Have mercy on me, O God, have mercy on me, for in you my soul takes refuge. I will take refuge in the shadow of your wings until the disaster has passed. The opening words of Psalm 57. Evelyn Waugh's story, A Handful of Dust, tells the story of Tony Last, a man who owns a great Gothic manor in the early part of the 20th century. He's rich, he's comfortable, with a wife, family. And the story, as it progresses, tells of how he loses everything. His wife, his prosperity. He ends up in the depth of a jungle, unable to escape. His entire fortune, everything he's based his life on, has gone, vanished, a handful of dust. And so it was with David. From his successes against the Philistines, and he's being given command of armies, Saul's jealousy, madness took over and drove him away, till ultimately he's in a cave. 1 Samuel chapter 22 verse 1. David takes refuge in the cave of Adullam. It's not the only cave he takes refuge in. If you look in 1 Samuel chapter 24, we read in verse 2, So Saul took 3,000 chosen men from all Israel and set out to look for David and his men near the crags of the wild goats. He came to the sheep pens along the way. A cave was there, and Saul went in to relieve himself. David and his men were far back in the cave. From the heights of success, the dazzling cries of Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. From a high place with prospects for a successful career, David is reduced to skulking fearfully at the back of the king's toilet cave. And it's with one of those caves in mind, almost certainly, that Psalm 57 is written. Psalm 56, we read from its introduction, has a very similar background. At the time just before the incidents with the cave, where David had taken refuge amongst his enemies, the Philistines. We read there that Psalm 56 was inspired by that time. What do you notice about verses 5 and 11 in Psalm 57? Take a moment to look at them and see what you observe. It's quite straightforward. No complications, not rocket science. They are the same. We have therefore here in this psalm a two-part structure, each rounded by this chorus. So let's have a look at what goes on here. And let's begin by just reflecting that the psalm is about the time when David had fled into a cave. How do you think this cave, as well as being a literal place where David went, is also a metaphor for his mental condition and his thinking and feeling? Take a moment to think about it and ask yourself how the presence in the depths of a cave, in the darkness, unable to see the sky and the light, might reflect on his literal position and his mental state. And now let's look at verse 1. Have mercy on me, Lord, have mercy on me, for in you my soul takes refuge. I will take refuge in the shadow of your wings until the disaster has passed. Notice the repeats in this verse. Very emphatic. Have mercy on me, Lord. Have mercy on me. Who is actually tormenting him? Is it God? And yet he asks God to stop the pain, to stop the hurt. Have mercy, spare me from this. Of course, God is not inflicting this on him, but it is to God he turns immediately to seek relief. And what does he look for? In you my soul takes refuge. I will take refuge. Twice again he repeats this key idea of refuge. And it's a positive mood. Not a negative, a positive mood. Refugio, to flee back to. Back to somewhere where he can obtain some support, some strength, some recovery. Not just running away aimlessly. A refuge is a place you go back to obtain protection and help. It's a positive move towards the one who is his refuge and strength, to God. Notice in that verse 1, we also have the image, the meaning of under your wing. What are the overtones? What are the meanings of that image? What comes to your mind? Give it some thought just for a moment. And do you think of tenderness and care? How the mother bird shelters the chicks from the elements, from cold, from wind and harm. There's an aspect of frailty as well. Both the mother and the chicks are not strong, but the chicks are weaker, and they look to the protection of the mother bird. In that same weakness, David seeks the protection of one who is stronger than he. It's an image used in other psalms, and you can look for yourself at Psalm 17 and verse 8, or Psalm 36 and verse 7, or Psalm 63 and verse 7. Notice too that the cave is not the refuge, which is what David presumably first thought, going to take shelter. That's not the protection. That's not the shelter. The refuge is under the shelter of the wings of God. Verse 2. I cry out to God Most High, to God who fulfills his purpose for me. From the depths of the cave, he calls to the Most High. A strange juxtaposition when you think about it. From the depths of a cave, from the depths of darkness where he can see nothing, he calls to the one who is highest up. Here is David in the bowels of the earth, calling to the one who is most high, most distant. And yet he trusts that God will come to him, will rescue him, will see him in the depths of the cave. Verse 3. He, that is God, sends from heaven and saves me, rebuking those who hotly pursue me. Even at that distance, he trusts God to hear him and send just his rebuke. Just the word of God will be enough to stop his enemies. And then we have, in the text, Selah. Ask yourself, what is Selah? Do you know? In fact, it's not certain. Several interpretations have been suggested. It could be a musical interlude. It could be a moment of Amen, so be it. It could be a moment of stop and listen. There is some possibility that there is a meaning of something being lifted or raised up. Hands, instruments, voices, faces. Whichever of these meanings it is, it's an unusual place in the middle of the verse like this. But it nevertheless underlines, it emphasizes the previous statement. Here he sends from heaven and saves me, rebuking those who hotly pursue me. God sends his love and faithfulness, he reiterates, after that meaningful pause, after that raising up of hands or instruments, whichever it is. Verse 4. I am in the midst of lions. I lie among the ravenous beasts, men whose teeth are spears and arrows, whose tongues are sharp swords. Ellison in his commentary asks, what were these dangers? Think for just a moment about the background for David and his enmity with Saul and his current position. What were the dangers? Enumerate them. There is Saul himself, his pathological enemy. There are the men who are with him, the soldiers. There are the wild beasts that are around in this lonely countryside, these desert places. In those days too, there were bands of marauders, brigands, bandits, looking for anybody weaker than themselves to plunder, take advantage of. There were traitors. David could not even be sure of the men around him. And we've already read of one person, Doeg, in 1 Samuel, who was a traitor and betrayed him to the king. And there are bounty hunters. David has a price on his head. Saul wants him dead. There are people perhaps looking, hoping to be rewarded by the king. There are dangers all around. It was Martin Luther who created a picture of the church and suggested to people, think of the church as being out there surrounded by great lions, threatening them. The paradox is that in the middle of this we're reading, I am in the midst of lions, I lie down among ravenous beasts. The paradox of lying down, resting, sleeping even, surrounded by these wild creatures. Can he do that? Can he succeed? Lions, beasts, sharp teeth, weapons. It's metaphorical and literal. The wild beasts with their sharp teeth. The wild men with their sharp weapons. And their sharp voices. All those who've joined in Saul's condemnation of him. Words do hurt. And David has been condemned in word as well as potentially in action. When the Apostle Peter wrote, he suggested that the enemy of our soul was something like a lion against us. He writes, be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary the devil walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. See 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8. So when we are threatened by the devil, it is a similar position, and we too can appeal to God as David did. So what's the overall tone of part 1? Overall, there is fear, there is trembling, there is pain, there is hurt, there is darkness, the depths of the cave, and yet there is a shaft of light, of hope in God. And the refrain in verse 5 comes up. Be exalted, O God, above the heavens. Let your glory be over all the earth. From out of the depths, David can make this cry. And this cry is the refrain for the whole psalm, no matter how bad things have been now. That is David's position. And so we come to the second part of the psalm, and let's see if the tone has changed. Verse 6, they spread a net for my feet. I was bowed down in distress. They dug a pit in my path. But they have fallen into it themselves. And there is the reply, Selah. The picture of a trap. How many traps had Saul made for David? Just have a think for a few seconds. Yes, he had tried to kill him when David was singing and performing to him with his music. Saul had invited him to marry his daughter. Saul had sent him to be the leader against the Philistines, with a little bit of hope that maybe David wouldn't come back. Saul had summoned him to a feast to catch him. Saul had put a traitor in amongst David's associates. Saul was pursuing him with an army. Oh yes, the image of traps in verse 6 is very strong and very well based. All of these ways to catch him, but they have fallen into it themselves, and that reinforcing Selah is there. Yes, they have indeed. Verses 7 to 8. What do these verses remind us of in terms of what David is and what he's about? My heart is steadfast, O God. My heart is steadfast. I will sing and make music. Awake, my soul, awake, harp and lyre. I will awaken the dawn. And it reminds us what? Yes, David is a poet. David is a musician. And he's returning to the gifts God has given him. He's going to make use of them. A challenge in its way. What happened last time David used his instruments in the palace? Indeed, he was only just able to escape with his life when Saul tried to kill him. It's important not to forget the gifts that God has endowed us with, to make use of those skills and talents. And David will make use of these. Awake, my soul, awake, harp and lyre. Wake up, bestir yourselves. You're not going to be asleep. Let's hear you sound. I will make you sound. I will awaken the dawn. He will be so loud that the dawn itself, in the darkness with which he is surrounded, will be woken. There will be light where there was darkness. What about 9 and 10? I will praise you, Lord, among the nations. I will sing of you among the peoples. For great is your love, reaching to the heavens. Your faithfulness reaches to the skies. How's that a contrast with verses 7 and 8? You could say that 7 and 8 are very personal. The talents of David, the music, the skills on the harp and lyre, his poetry. Verses 9 and 10 are public. I will praise you, O Lord, among the nations. I will sing of you among the people. Are there times where our outer image is different from our private one? It's interesting too to see that here is David in the cave, talking of reaching to the heavens. The blackness and the darkness are to be no barrier. He will raise his voice. He will bestir the heavens. Your faithfulness reaches to the skies. Your love reaches to the heavens. Very different. Let's remember the resurrection of Jesus from the grave, foreshadowed in the deliverance of David from the hand of Saul, a transaction which caused the heavens and all the powers therein to extol the mercy and truth of God. Thus says commentator Horn in his writing. So how different is the tone of part 2 from part 1? think it is very different. From the blackness, the all-embracing shadows of part 1, with few flickering signs of hope, we find ourselves carried out of the darkness, into the light, out of the depths of the earth, up towards heaven, reinforced in that chorus that comes again in verse 11. Be exalted, O God, above the heavens. Let your glory be over all the earth. The underlying conviction of the psalm is that God will not fail me. Even in the depths of black despair, even in the depths of the dark cave, God can bring his faithful out to exalt him in the heavens.